Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Diana Furch-Gott-Roth. I direct Economics 21 at the Manhattan Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this meeting of the Shadow Open Market Committee. The Shadow Open Market Committee has the foremost monetary economists in the world. We're especially happy this meeting to present a new book by Professor Charles Calomiris, Reforming Financial Regulation After Dodd-Frank. It's right here. It is in your packets. And we hope that you will read it carefully and take these recommendations and make sure that our legislature implements them. So with that, Marvin Goodfriend of Carnegie Mellon University is going to introduce and chair the first panel. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Diana. Welcome to the SOMC symposium, and I especially want to welcome all of you who have come at the very beginning, because being here as an early bird is much appreciated by the committee, especially for those of us that speak early. My job is to introduce the first session. I'm going to speak first. We have Athanasios Orphanides of Massachusetts Institute of Technology will speak second, and he will speak on the case against monetary rules. And Peter Ireland will speak next. Peter is from Boston College, and Peter and Mickey Levy, who unfortunately can't be here today, will speak on a strategy for normalizing monetary policy. And I'll leave Greg Hess to introduce the second panel session, which includes Charlie Calomiris, who you've already heard of, and a new member of our committee, Deborah Lucas from MIT. And so with that, I'd like not to use up more of my time, and let me start by saying I'm going to speak about the Fed needs a credible commitment to price stability. You may know that the Fed, I'm sure you know that the Fed has a 2% inflation target. I'm going to talk about why it really is not all that credible and why it should be made more credible. I think I chose a little bit too small a type size for this particular draft, but let me see if I can read this. I'm glad that some of you know what that means. So in January 2012, the Federal Open Market Committee adopted a 2% inflation target in its Statement of Longer Run Goals and Monetary Policy Strategy. The statement as currently written is a good first start, but the statement stops short of committing the Fed fully to an inflation target, and in some ways, it actually undermines the target's credibility. That's what I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes. I will recommend improvements in the statement itself near the end of my talk to lock down the public's belief and confidence in the inflation target. But before I do so, I want to discuss three specific, concrete, operational ways in which failing to do so creates problems for monetary policy and the economy more broadly. In particular, one, as I'll elaborate in a minute, failing to be fully credible about the 2% inflation target actually increases risk inherent in using the federal funds rate to manage longer-term interest rates in the way the Fed likes to think about monetary policy. Again, I'll explain that in a minute. Two, failing to make the inflation target fully credible invites a reemergence of cyclical inflation-fighting risk premia in long-term bond rates. I'll get into that in a minute, too. And finally, failing to make the 2% target fully credible forces households to guard against inflation risk and thereby greatly increases household financial insecurity over a working lifetime and in retirement. Well, the problem is I printed this on two 8x11 to one 8x11 page. That's my problem. Saving paper, but not much foresight. Okay, the first thing, why is it that a weak inflation target worsens interest rate policy risk? The Fed manages the federal funds rate target to maximize its influence over longer-term interest rates and thereby on the economy. To do so, the Fed waits before changing the federal funds rate target until it's relatively sure that it will not have to reverse field anytime soon and that further changes in the same direction are likely. Markets, in turn, understand that the Fed's interest rate target changes are, quote, highly persistent and seldom quickly reversed. That's a phrase that I dreamt up about 20 years ago. In this way, a change in the overnight federal funds rate target creates expected future short rates and longer-term interest rates carries expected future short rates and longer-term rates with it as well. The Fed's inclination to delay federal funds rate target changes explains why monetary policy has been behind the curve so often in the past. This is a problem in the way interest rate policy works, and it's not going to go away anytime soon. My point here is that the problem is exacerbated by a failure to make the 2% inflation target more credible, and here's why. Operational risk inherent in interest rate policy is exacerbated because the public is unsure of the Fed's commitment to its inflation target. And when the inflation target lacks credibility, the Fed may feel the need to act more preemptively than otherwise against rising inflation to assure markets of its commitment to the inflation target. The problem is, by moving more preemptively, the Fed must accept a greater risk of moving prematurely, having to reverse field shortly thereafter, and thereby undermining the mutual understanding with markets that federal funds rate target changes are highly persistent and seldom quickly reversed. This may sound odd if you haven't thought about this or you're not in the markets, but you can imagine that if the Fed whipsaws markets by moving the Fed funds rate up and then back down numbers of times, it's not likely that any action on the Fed funds rate will carry expected future Fed funds rates with it. And basically, the Fed will be operating on the overnight interest rate, not carrying out the yield curve and having very little effect on the economy. So monetary policy is a balancing act of remembering this fundamental tension. The problem is, if the Fed, just to repeat, has not tied down the credibility of its 2% target, if it gets into a situation such as it is today, likely has to move prematurely and accept the risk of reversing field and undermining the very convention that enables the federal funds rate targeting strategy to carry longer-term rates. Okay. 2, weak inflation targeting credibility invites a reemergence of cyclical inflation-fighting risk premia. During the Great Inflation period from 1965 to 1985, we had 4 recessions deliberately precipitated by the Fed to contain rising inflation. These inflation-fighting recessions involved a tightening of monetary policy that raised interest rates to collapse aggregate demand to bring inflation back down. So in these recessions, interest rate policy tightened, long-term bond rates collapsed, and the economy was moved into recession. These recessions were ones in which long-term bond prices moved inversely to the Fed's interest rate policy. These recessions were ones in which the Fed created a covariance between long-term bond prices and consumption risk that was unhelpful. So if you wanted to hold a long-term bond, you had to expect that when you needed your money the most in recession, the bond price collapsed. And so, sure enough, if you look at the term premium in bond rates moving from 1965 to 1980, the term premium goes up from about 1% by various estimates to around 4 percentage points. Not surprising. I would call this inflation fighting risk premia in long-term bond rates. The problem for monetary policy today is that the credibility of the Fed's 2% inflation target is about to be tested for the first time. We saw the employment rate today. It seems to be still in train. And this raises the possibility of a reemergence of cyclical inflation-fighting concerns, which have the potential to elevate risk premia in long-term bond rates suddenly and sharply. I should point out that since Paul Volcker ended the Great Inflation, in the 20 subsequent years, the term premia has come back down from around 4% to near zero today. The problem the Fed, I think, has to worry about is that by being too ill-committed to its inflation target, a pop in the term premium, moving it back up in the direction where it was in the bad old days. Now, the last time we had an inflation scare of this kind was in 1994, 1995. There was roughly a 2 percentage point pop in the long-term bond rate. By all accounts, that was not due to inflation expectations. It was best understood as a pop in the term premia. People thought maybe in the mid-1990s the Fed would be forced into an inflationary regime again. There's a bunch of reasons for that. Luckily, at the time, that didn't happen. As we all know, the Fed stabilized inflation. The term premium came down within a year, and we had low inflation ever since. The third point I want to talk about is weak inflation targeting credibility increases household financial insecurity. If in years past the Fed had fully committed it to price stability as embodied in a 2% inflation target, retirees would be in a much better situation today. Years ago, households would have been advised and willing to hold a significant share of their lifetime savings in long-term nominal bonds, paying a safe nominal rate of interest. Households could have counted upon the fact that nominal interest would have been locked in purchasing power terms by the not locked, but locked to the 2% inflation target. The promised nominal yield would include the 2% inflation premium and then a secure real rate of return, which back in the day would have been much higher than the riskless real rate of return on long-term bonds is today. In fact, it would have been in the vicinity of 3 to 4%. That would have been a pretty good deal for today's retirees. That didn't happen. Instead, the great inflation called the Fed's commitment to price stability into question. It decimated the real returns on long-term bonds in the great inflation period. Reasonable households have since steered away from saving in long-term nominal bonds to protect themselves from inflation risk. And to avoid inflation risk, households have shortened the maturity of their debt, putting themselves in jeopardy of low short-term interest rate risk. And they've also reached for yield in risky equities. So in my view, the last and most important reason that the Fed should commit more strongly to the 2% inflation target is to enable households and retirees to gain some security, some financial security that they can't otherwise get. So my last point is, what do I think the statement should do, the Fed's 2012 statement should do to improve the Fed's commitment to the 2% inflation target? 3 things. First, the statement should be modified to make clear that its roots lie in the mistakes and successes of past Fed policy. You look at the statement now, it's completely standalone. It reads kind of like forgive me, a boilerplate mission statement. But it didn't come out of nowhere. The statement did not get handed down on some mountain. And with modern technology, the Fed could link it to whatever narratives they have of their own history that says, here's where we learned this stuff from. And in my view, that would be the most important thing for the Fed to do, to make the public understand that this statement is not some mission statement. It's based on 100 years of mistakes and successes. Second, the statement ends by saying that the committee intends to reaffirm its statement annually. The open-ended invitation to reaffirm, to me, is counterproductive in a document that purports to be about longer-run goals of monetary policy strategy. This is not something you want to reaffirm on an annual basis. So I think somehow they should get that language out of there, at least insofar as it refers to their 2% inflation target. And then finally, the FOMC should declare its intention in the statement to invite the legislature to accept the inflation target to further enhance its credibility. The FOMC is kind of like, if you will, this is maybe a reach, but bear with me, the Surgeon General of monetary policy. It does monetary policy, but it's also responsible for telling the public what the best science of monetary policy says. And in that basis, it should invite the legislature to hold it accountable to the 2% inflation target. And to do so, the Fed should include in the statement its intention to improve the legislative oversight by presenting the FOMC's independently chosen monetary policy decisions against a familiar Taylor-type reference rule for monetary policy that would tighten down the oversight hearings and make it clear to the public and the Congress that the Fed is serious about this commitment to 2% inflation. And I believe, on the whole, this kind of behavior by the Fed's bringing the oversight authorities sort of into its confidence would be the best way to commit the country credibly to a 2% inflation target. Thank you. I think a little bit odd, I'm the moderator. I think I'll open the floor for a couple of questions, and then we'll move on to Athanasios and Peter, and if anybody has any questions. I'll get you first. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. Do you feel that what is maybe preventing the Fed from coming up with that more?
Yeah, wait. Yeah, I'm sorry. Wait till you get the mic so we can get this recorded.
Thank you. Do you feel that what maybe is preventing the Fed from having that strong 2% policy is that they're concerned for their other job? I mean, of maybe making sure the labor market is as strong as they think it should be?
I'm sure that that's part of the reason that they think there's some benefit into allowing themselves some discretion. But I don't think it's productive to allow yourself discretion over the longer run target. We're talking, after all, about the longer run strategic target for interest rate policy for inflation. It's possible, in fact, as I argued at the very beginning, I would make the case that you get better outcomes with interest rate policy by committing to the 2% inflation target over the long run. And again, to reiterate my first point, is by doing that, the Fed has a little more freedom of action with short-term interest rate policy. It doesn't have to move prematurely or risk moving prematurely to convince the public that it's serious about inflation. It gets more time to look at the current situation before it has to move. My own feeling is that may be the kind of situation we're in right now. I don't have time to go into it, but I think that's possible. Yeah.
Hi, Marvin. Doug Carr from Carr Capital. How are you? When you talk about 2%, the Fed has repeatedly done this. Last session that you guys had, 2% is all we hear from them. But Paul Volcker has pointed out that it's unwise, not feasible, to be targeting the inflation rate within a few tenths of a percent. If we've essentially been at 1.8% for course PCE, isn't that good enough? You know, it's good enough for government work, and the Fed's part of the government. So what kind of range would you propose that's consistent with 2%, but practical from an execution standpoint?
So, you know, on this one, I'm willing to have a debate about this point. I don't regard this point as central to my main message. And in years past, I've been on the side of a band. I've been on the side of a lot of varieties of some sort of commitment to price stability. I would love, the way it used to be described, stabilizing the purchasing power of money, an old-fashioned phrase, but that's not in the cards, so I've moved over to 2% inflation target. I'm happy to have a debate. This is, in my view, a kind of a technical matter that involves not only the technical side, like you were talking about, but the side of convincing the public you're serious, which is the belief side. So I think if this were a meeting of the FOMC, we would have to talk about this for the next few hours before I could make up my mind on it. Right now, I want to tie down the beliefs that the public has in the Fed's commitment to keeping inflation at 2% for the next 30 years, so they can hold long-term bonds and get some financial security. Well, I think if it's
Ram Bhagavatula. Just a very quick question. You raise an issue that's really not uppermost even in if you measure credibility by what forward inflation expectations are doing in the marketplace, they're all very firmly anchored to 2%. So in some sense, the Fed is succeeding in exactly what you're suggesting.
That's a great point. Here's my counter example to that. Yes, it's true that inflation expectations are anchored by various measures, but if you go to a financial advisor, this is the great city of financial advice. Is anybody going to advise average working people to hold 30-year government bonds for the next 30 years? Absolutely not. That would be irresponsible financial advice. And that's the point I'm making here. Not the fact that inflation expectations are anchored by some minority of people who are experts. Once financial advisors in New York City decide that it's okay to recommend their clients to hold 30-year bonds, then I'm with you. In fact, that would be a pretty good badge of honor for the Fed. We've got to get back there. By the way, I'm talking from experience. My father held 30-year bonds in the 1960s and 70s. My inheritance was crushed. I think we got to move on. So we're going to hear from Athanasios Orphanides now, the case against monetary rules.
Thanks, Marvin. Yes, I'm saving paper too. I printed this in a different way. I'm going to start by saying that I will follow exactly where Marvin ended. This is in part coordination, but in part because we feel very strongly about the topic. And on this topic, we have very similar views. I want to remind you, last time we were discussing something here where completely different views. Not this time. On this topic, we're on the same views. And we'll start by observing that monetary theory as well as monetary practice, and Marvin mentioned some of this, suggests that economic outcomes are better when monetary policy is systematic and respects the importance of maintaining price stability, which I'm just repeating in different words what was just said. And I will also follow by focusing on the statement that the Fed issued in January of 2012. In my view, that was a very important step forward in making and adopting a precise quantitative definition of price stability that we did not have before. And I could have a question on the bands and so forth. The important element is to take ownership of what the Fed means by price stability and then try to be convincing. I would also agree with Marvin that that has not been tested since it had been adopted. So it was adopted in 2012, but the recession was deep enough, monetary policy could have been easy, there was no challenge faced in that. And now we're entering into a phase where this may be tested, and this is what makes us a little bit more worried about how this could be tightened up. So in my view, additional progress is required because the current policy framework places too much emphasis on meeting-by-meeting discretion and is not sufficiently systematic to be in line with best policy practice. And this is problematic because of the Fed's dual mandate. So if the Fed only had price stability as the goal, this could be handled much better. But with a dual mandate, where we can run into situations with conflict, if the unemployment rate stays where it is or keeps falling further, we're going to actually have rising inflation. And then we're going to go back to the trade-offs and wondering, so which way would the Fed respond? And would the Fed take more seriously the maximum employment part of its mandate or more seriously the price stability part of its mandate? This is still something that has not been clarified. And this is a tension that has been highlighted since the 2012 statement, because in that statement, the Fed pretty much adopted the verbatim interpretation of the mandate that actually places maximum employment and price stability together, which was very different from what was happening under Paul Volcker or Alan Greenspan earlier on during the disinflation phase. So combination of the meeting-by-meeting discretion that we have right now and the multiple conflicting goals creates this vulnerability for mistakes that I would associate with the lack of clarity and absence of systematic monetary policy. Now, we know how to fix this. It's actually one of those things where you say, what if the Fed were to adopt a simple policy rule and actually clearly say, this is the policy rule that will deliver our 2% inflation objective over the long run, and this is how it also fights business cycle fluctuations. Then we would not really have this uncertainty. And you know the debate, it has been there. We have recent legislation that's suggesting these elements as well. However, when I look at the views that are coming from inside the Fed system, I see exactly the opposite. So have in the first few months of this year, for example, we had Chair Yellen and Vice Chair Fisher both presenting cases against monetary rules. And I think to make progress in this debate, I think we should tackle head-on what are the arguments against rules and see whether the concerns are really so substantial that we should allow the Fed to continue with this meeting-by-meeting discretion, or if we're not convinced, then actually keep pressing for the Fed to adopt a rule. So perhaps the most common argument, one I hear a lot, is that discretion allows for greater flexibility to policy to take into account the uncertainty that policymakers face. I think it's very important to acknowledge uncertainty. Policymakers face numerous dimensions of uncertainty. Our understanding of how the economy works is always incomplete and evolves over time. Our estimated macroeconomic models are imperfect. Often we have competing models that are equally plausible, and they would have very different implications. So uncertainty is quite fundamental to the policy problem. Key concepts, the equilibrium real interest rate, for example, it would be nice to know these things. We don't know these things. They evolve over time. So we need to recognize and tackle uncertainty head on. Is this a valid reason for continuing with meeting by meeting discretion? I don't really see it. Uncertainty is not an argument against the values of systematic policy. This is really what the question is. So systematic monetary policy is as valuable and possibly more valuable if we have uncertainty than when we don't. So it's not clear how uncertainty becomes an argument against policy rules. But we need to look into this a little bit more closely and find what the arguments are. So what is one argument is dynamic inconsistency. So this is one of the major policy problems associated with discretionary policy that the adoption of a policy rule solves. Okay, so is dynamic inconsistency an issue that is any different if we face a lot of uncertainty about the economy or if we don't face a lot of uncertainty about the economy? Not really. So you can't really use the uncertainty to diminish the importance of having a rule for solving the dynamic consistency problem. Consider the issue that Marvin mentioned earlier, the formation of expectations. One of the problems with forming expectations, especially long-term expectations, is that it's much easier to do both for households and for businesses if they know what government agencies are doing and what the Fed is doing. If they don't, and they say, well, they're going to meet again in 6 weeks, who knows what they're going to decide? It's actually much harder to form expectations. Well, I don't think uncertainty makes discretion better when I consider that consideration either. Uncertainty is also useful to address in a different direction that shows up in this debate. This has to do with what do we mean by a simple rule. It is correctly noted that since the structure of the economy is changing, if we were to have a simple, fixed, immutable, responsive rule, that rule is not going to be working well all the time. As the economy changes, you would want to adapt the rule in order to make sure that it would work well. The Taylor rule actually is a very good example on this one. So some versions of the Taylor rule require as an element, a key element, the equilibrium real interest rate, the natural rate of interest assumption. Well, when John Taylor first developed it, he said 2%. Is it sensible if someone is formulating policy with that type of Taylor rule to always have a 2% equilibrium real interest rate if other information suggests big changes, that maybe it's zero? The answer is, well, no. In that particular framework, you would want to make adjustments accordingly. So that's a situation where the presence of uncertainty isn't really an argument in favor of discretion. The presence of uncertainty is an argument for envisioning what process of adaptation we would want to have in place so that we can adjust the policy rule we're using as we learn more about the economy and as the economy evolves. So this is really the tension we have. And for this reason, it's important when we describe the choice, rules versus discretion, and in my case, it's discretion versus simple monetary policy rules. What exactly am I describing? What exactly am I suggesting that should be compared to discretion to make the comparison sensible? So in my view, to account for the evolving understanding of the economy, the Federal Reserve should adopt a framework that relies on a simple policy rule that is, however, subject to periodic reviews and adaptation. And what I see, and this is not different from what have been proposed in different ways, I'm just organizing in a particular way, I could see the committee actually selecting a policy rule following a rigorous evaluation process that would ensure robustness, taking into account all of the dimensions of uncertainty that can be incorporated into macroeconometric policy evaluation. That would include uncertainty about natural rates, the formation of expectations, dynamic structure of the economy, and so forth. And then I go back to the point Marvin mentioned. If you developed a rule like that, that is the strategy that should be included in a more detailed statement on longer-run goals and monetary policy strategy. That one-pager has some benefits, and it describes the goals, but it doesn't really describe a strategy. And the idea is to add the strategy component to that statement. So adding a policy rule that is developed by the Federal Reserve to that statement would complete and improve that statement tremendously. It's equally important to acknowledge in this way, and I want to stress this, that setting monetary policy following a rule is a living process. You cannot just say, oh, here we have the classic Taylor rule, 2 and 2 and 1/2 on this and 1/2 on this one without clarifying anything, and that's set in stone. You cannot do that anymore, that it would be sensible to do a K% rule and say, oh yeah, the only thing we're going to do is have M0 or M2 and grow at a 4% rate or something like that. You want to be somewhat more flexible to account for the changes in the economy that we see happening all the time. We can evaluate that. But that shouldn't be an excuse for, oh, we're not going to follow a rule, meeting by meeting discretion. This is the tension. So what the Fed could do is that by formulating and stating a rule, it would actually enhance its credibility. The rule could be monitored by outsiders. The annual evaluation process that I foresee would actually allow the Federal Reserve to explain when it's adjusting the rule, why it's adjusting the rule based on improvements in our knowledge, what we've learned about models that don't work, and so forth. This is a dynamic process that would improve policy quite a bit. Now, I note that the way I describe this, one could map it into versions of the Federal Oversight Reform and Modernization Form Act. I mean, the Form Act actually does say the Fed should study the economy and come up with its own preferred rule. What I'm suggesting is actually very much in line with that, and it's a matter of protecting the process so that the Fed can independently and transparently do this in a fair fashion. But I would go on and say that I think it would be unfortunate if the Federal Reserve Act need to change in order to see improvements in the operations of the Fed in situations like this one when the Fed can implement things like that on its own. Remember, for example, the 2012 statement with the great innovation of the 2% inflation goal did not come out because of a change in the Federal Reserve Act. This was a recognition after 20, 30 years of internal discussion that it would be a good idea to clarify the inflation objective of the Federal Reserve. I'm going to close by recounting a recent exchange I had with Vice Chair Fisher on this matter. I mean, Stan Fisher was one of my teachers at MIT, and what I find particularly remarkable about him for this literature is that he was one of the first people, for those of you who are studying the early 70s monetary policy evaluation literature. He had papers with Philip Kuber. Among those papers, he was doing early work of doing robustness analysis of policy rules in competing models. And the models they were using for the competition were what they used to call the FRB MIT Penn model and the St. Louis Monetarist model. So the history is there. Last February, the vice chair delivered a speech arguing in favor of discretion over monetary rules. And for the title, he used a famous quote by Paul Samuelson highlighting the value of good judgment and models for policy analysis. And I will remind you of that quote. I'm sure you will recognize it. So Paul Samuelson said, "I'd rather have Bob Solow than an econometric model. comma. But I'd rather have Bob Solow with an econometric model than without one. And you know, for those who understand the value of modeling, and especially Bob Solow, this is so true. And you know, and he had the best advice, but he would do it better with a model. Well, while I fully subscribe to the use of models and value judgment, I thought that this wasn't really a complete case in favor of discretion of the rules. So I sent the vice chair an email, and in my email I was saying I'd rather have Bob Solow with a model and the rule, following a careful evaluation process. And then I went on to describe what I thought the superb research staff of the Federal Reserve System could deliver. This is the best team to actually deliver on this particular element. So Vice Chair responded with another speech in March. And while acknowledging how a careful evaluation process could proceed, he appeared to remain unconvinced and ended his speech by noting, quote, "However, I tend to agree with John Taylor and my Fed colleague John Williams when they write that, quote again, the search for better and more robust policy rules is never done," close both quotes. So once again, I find myself in this situation where I fully agree with the quotes. Yeah, sure. You know, the search for a better and more robust rule is never done. But I'm not sure I understand why from that statement it follows that meeting by meeting discretion is better rather than a rule. So my thought would have been that perhaps we should acknowledge the imperfect knowledge we have and simply promote the best possible systematic policy we have with a rule that reflects our current state of knowledge. And we should realize that this should be adapted from time to time, which, by the way, doing some more research in other of Stan's writings, he had pointed out in his survey on rules versus discretion in 1990. And I stop here.
I think we can take a couple of questions now, if you'd like. Okay. Wait till the mic comes.
Krishna Guha from Evercore ISI. A question for Athanasios. Athanasios, as you know, a lot of the debate around rules is really focused on Taylor-type rules. But there seem to be a lot of challenges using a Taylor-type rule in a period where there's a lot of uncertainty around the equilibrium real rate. So I wonder whether you might believe at this point it would be preferable to use a first difference type rule that would be more robust to some of the uncertainties that we face today.
Well, personally, indeed, I would. My preferred simple rules are of the Wickselian style, that are first difference rules and do not include values of the equilibrium real interest rate or any other natural rate, for that matter. But frankly, I think we need to be open to how do we design a simple rule. So really, if I were on the inside, I would have been lobbying inside the Federal Reserve to have a project for all of the system could participate in, with competing models and competing rules. I could envision, for example, policy rules that would be similar to John Taylor's classic rule, but also attached to them an auxiliary methodology that describes how you adjust the equilibrium real interest rate if you really want to tie yourself to those kinds of rules. And one could compare the robustness properties of the alternatives. So I wouldn't rule anything out a priori. And the whole point of the exercise is to incorporate all of the uncertainty in all of the different dimensions that we do not have, so that we can do it transparently and then see how the economy would have performed with alternatives.
Over here. This one.
These two presentations have really been great so far. I just wanted to sort of make a point and get you to comment on it, which is how different it would be, for really two related points. First, how different it would be to read the FOMC minutes if the main function of the FOMC was to discuss the relative merits of different models. We'd learn a lot about how the Fed is thinking. There'd be a lot of real content and value to those FOMC minutes if they were talking about the relative merits of models. And then related to that, I also want to point out that obviously one doesn't have to choose one model, because one rule could be an averaging, a weighted average of more than one. So I just want to point out that there isn't necessarily a rigidity or an ideological sort of strictness to this. There can even be flexibility built in by having more than one view that's averaged when one's thinking about these things, and then even imagining the weights evolving over time. I mean, I know that's a little impractical, perhaps, from the standpoint of what we're used to. But if the point of the FOMC were to deliberate on the model, because after all, the actual outcome is simply a mapping from observables into outcomes. So the only point, in some sense, of the FOMC meeting under this proposal, and I very much agree with it, is the discussion of models. So I think that would be a very interesting aspect, don't you agree?
Well, let me point out briefly in this one that variations of what you describe would be how one would go about developing a robust, simple rule when we are uncertain about models. Not exactly the averaging you described, but again, the Fed system has superb staff that would do this exactly as it should be done in terms of statistics. It's not necessarily about the models. You may have people around the table who actually believe that we should not be relying too much on models and believe that we should be relying on simpler indicators. That's okay. This could be included in an evaluation saying, if this is how you think, what would the economy look like? I would still have a model to simulate what your result would be. You would have a discussion where you can indeed incorporate different views and still arrive at a strategy that is common. So here's the difference. Right now, the discussion is people may have different views around the table, and the whole discussion is, what do we do to the Fed funds rate at this meeting? And then a few weeks later, same discussion, different people, different views. What do we do with the Fed funds rate at this meeting? And that's fine for figuring out what the Fed funds rate is going to be, but nobody from the outside can tell what is the systematic nature of policy. So this is the problem that is not being solved with the current process. And once we convince ourselves from the theory and the history that the most important aspect is the systematic nature of policy, we would want to change the procedure to ensure that policy is systematic and that the committee describes about how to best achieve that systematic policy.
Okay. I think we should move on. John, okay, go ahead.
As a journalist, I would have to write, once you adopted a rule in a somewhat conditional way, saying that as things evolve, this rule may change. How do I explain to the public something that will convince them to buy 30-year bonds when I would have to also say, well, this is a rule, but the rule may be changed at any time according to their assessment of what's going on in the economy? That, to me, comes across very much like discretion.
Yeah, well, it's not actually the way you describe, because you would select a rule based on the current understanding of the economy. If the current understanding of the economy doesn't change, you wouldn't change the rule. So you would only make modifications to the rule if something happens that shows that one of the models we are using, for example, has broken down, it's not working anymore. But those are exactly the situations where anybody inside and outside the Fed would be changing their views about the outlook anyway. So you're just admitting what is happening in practice anyway, and you're putting more systematic nature to the decision-making process while you are doing it.
Okay, I'm going to intervene for two reasons. One is to say there's no reason to change the 2% inflation target. period. These are separate issues. I don't know of any good reason to change it. Athanasios and I say we're agreeing on this. I don't know if we do agree on this, but I think we do. Okay, I thought he just forgot to say that. All right, let's hear from Peter then. Peter is going to talk about a strategy for normalizing monetary policy.
Okay, and in listening to Athanasios and Marvin talk and listening to the questions from the floor, I think what I love the most is the way everybody has brought monetary theory, the lessons we learn from theory, and also monetary history, the lessons we learn from history, to bear on monetary policy problems that matter now, and recommending steps that can make things better now. Mickey Levy and I, in writing our paper for this session, wanted to do exactly the same thing. But by now, we wanted to push that a little bit further, and by now say, what should the Federal Reserve do in the very present moment? So what's been happening in the US economy in the very present moment? Well, so far, the economic data in 2017 have been very, very good. Solid growth in payrolls continues. We saw that again this morning. That's kept the unemployment rate low and stable. Measures of business and consumer confidence have jumped sharply higher. The outlook now for aggregate spending is as good as it's been in years. And most important for the Fed, and this was what Doug was getting at, I think, first and foremost in his comment just a moment ago, inflation has ticked higher as well, as measured by year-over-year percentage changes in the price index for personal consumption expenditures. Inflation is now running at 1.8%. Just a hair below the Fed's long-run target. So we can summarize by saying that if there was ever a time where, just based on the data alone, the Fed has achieved both sides of its dual mandate, this would have to be it. And as a matter of fact, against this most favorable backdrop, Federal Reserve policy appears to have reached an important inflection point in 2017 as well. Recent statements by key Fed officials, including Chair Janet Yellen, have made clear that the FOMC no longer sees itself struggling to provide monetary stimulus in order to fight against deflationary stagnation. That challenge has been replaced by a new one, the challenge of removing accommodation, scaling it back, to use the chair's own words, at an appropriate pace, fast enough to prevent a sustained overshoot of inflation above target, but at the same time measured enough to avoid threatening the ongoing economic expansion. So in our paper, Mickey Levy and I outline a strategy that we believe the Fed could use for meeting this new challenge most effectively, maximizing the probability for success. And building on the insights that we heard earlier from Marvin and Athanasios, a key element of this strategy involves asking the Federal Reserve to do these things: adopt, announce, and adhere to a specific quantitative rule for conducting monetary policy. Importantly, we believe the Fed shouldn't wait around for Congress to demand that it take this step. Instead, the FOMC should act unilaterally and immediately to do so, thereby disarming their critics and reassuring the public that they have in place a considered and coherent strategy for raising rates. Now, of course, there are many possible monetary policy rules for the Fed to choose among. But one of the most famous is John Taylor's, the simple rule that says that the funds rate should go up in response to movements in inflation and the output gap with a coefficient of 1.5 on the former and 0.5 on the latter. Athanasios also mentioned as an alternative Milton Friedman's K% rule for money growth, and elsewhere I've advocated a monetary policy rule like that recently too. But the big advantage that I see to a Taylor-type rule is that it describes behavior that's remarkably consistent with the way that observers, both inside and outside the Fed, see the Fed as behaving already, managing interest rates in order to control inflation and achieve modest counter-cyclical objectives. So this would not be a revolutionary change. This would be an incremental change. But by actually announcing and making consistent reference to the rule, the Fed would be emphasizing, as Athanasios said, the systematic component of its behavior and thereby enhancing their credibility by better explaining to the public exactly what they plan to do and why. And let me add another advantage to the list that Athanasios gave us. By adopting a Taylor-type rule, a rule that was formulated during the 1990s in a period where monetary policy is generally regarded as being quite successful, the Fed would also be seen as looking back in time at that point when monetary policy was successful and importing the settings for success or the recipe for success into the current day and age. That would be an important step, too, towards renormalizing monetary policy, again, enhancing the Federal Reserve's credibility as well. So let's think about a Taylor rule with a 2% inflation target. And again, I realize the issue of R star, the long-run real interest rate, is a controversial one right now. Let me just accept Janet Yellen's preferred setting for R star, 1%. That's the number that she's given and defended in light of recent evidence that real interest rates have fallen in the United States and elsewhere around the world. Let's take that version of the Taylor rule and see where it leads us. That version of the Taylor rule, for instance, would prescribe a long-run setting for the nominal federal funds rate equal to 3%, 2% target plus the 1% real rate. That's remarkably consistent with the central tendency in expectations from the FOMC for the long-run nominal interest rate, for the long-run Fed funds rate. So again, we're not talking about a revolutionary change. We're talking about an incremental change that would emphasize the Fed's systematic, deliberate behavior to bring monetary policy back where it needs to be. On the other hand, because inflation continues to run below target, and because there is still a lingering output gap left over after the Great Recession, that version of the Taylor rule today would imply a setting for the federal funds rate almost exactly equal to 2%. So below, 100 basis points below the long-run target, but on the other hand, 100 basis points above where the federal funds rate actually stands today. So by making consistent reference to that version of the Taylor rule, FOMC members could emphasize that in their view, monetary policy remains accommodative, and further action raising interest rates later on this year, that's not meant to derail the economic expansion. It's just necessary to bring interest rates back to where they should be ordinarily, given the current macroeconomic fundamentals. Assuming that this US economy continues to grow at a steady rate, melting away what's left of the output gap, that version of the Taylor rule would dictate a pace for future rate increases that would be determined almost entirely and appropriately by the pace at which inflation is seen to progress back to 2%, building on what Marvin said earlier. If inflation accelerates, that would dictate that the Fed needs to be more aggressive. If not, that would dictate maybe less aggressive. If inflation shows no progress anymore towards converging back to 2%, that would be a pretty strong signal that the Federal Reserve needs to pause in its campaign for interest rate increases, slow down, maybe even reverse course instead. But those decisions would all be made in a coherent framework, a consistent framework that made reference consistently to the Fed's long-run objectives. And then finally, assuming that the economy continues to evolve as expected, adhering to that rule would constrain the FOMC to follow through with rate increases that they've already planned and that they've already discussed, again, enhancing their credibility. So in summary, doing this, adopting a specific monetary policy rule, would seem to be an integral part of any strategy designed to achieve all of these things: raising interest rates, controlling inflation, renormalizing monetary policy, and laying the foundations for an enduring, sustained economic expansion. This is low-hanging fruit. This is something that the Fed should seize upon right away in the present moment to improve monetary policy making in the United States right now. Thanks. I'm happy to take questions.
Hugh McCullough, now adjunct at NYU. Before 2008, it was taken for granted that excess reserves did not pay interest, and therefore the Fed could stimulate the economy by creating excess reserves. The banks would hurry to get rid of them and make loans if people allowed to spend them. And then it could be tight by cutting back. The banks would scramble to call in loans, and that would be contractionary. Now, since 2008, the bank has been paying essentially the Fed funds rate on excess reserves, so there's no opportunity cost. So isn't the Fed totally rudderless now? I mean, what does the Fed, what control does the Fed have now that there's no opportunity cost to excess reserves?
Yes, that's an excellent question. I'd answer it first by saying another way of rephrasing the question in broader terms might be, are we nervous about the fact that the big size of the balance sheet right now, which involves the payment of interest on reserves, is untested as an operational approach for controlling inflation? And if the answer is, am I nervous about that? If the question is, am I nervous about that? The answer is yes. And so another thing that we do in the paper is to talk about a strategy for reducing the size of the Fed's balance sheet and maybe breaking away from interest on reserves. But let me tackle the question more directly as well. The Fed, the way we might see a successful strategy with a larger balance sheet and interest on reserves is working would be for the Fed to give banks an opportunity cost for holding reserves by maintaining a positive spread between the federal funds rate and the interest rate on reserves, so that we could think about the interest rate on reserves as a monetary policy tool that's directed more towards shifting the demand curve for reserves, that allows banks to willingly hold large dollar volume of reserves to maintain the stability of the financial system, let's say, but to still use the overall level of interest rates as a way of stabilizing prices and achieving modest counter-cyclical objectives. The idea would be that given a steady state where you have a large dollar volume of reserves outstanding, it would still be true that in order to bring about a situation where the Fed funds rate went up and the interest rate on reserves went up in tandem, the Fed would still have to conduct open market operations that drain reserves from the banking system, leading to downward pressure on money growth, nominal income, and ultimately inflation. But I agree with you, the system is untested, and that would be a reason for concern.
Anne Marie Muland, formerly of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, retired. I'm still struggling with the 2% inflation target. And I think one issue that bothers me is that the economics profession is not totally in accord with the notion of whether inflation is a good thing or a bad thing. And even within the Federal Reserve, there's some people who, for those of us who lived through the 70s, find shocking, can get themselves caught up with sort of rigid Phillips curves and say, oh, a little more inflation would be more stimulus, would involve more people getting jobs, and so on. And while the papers that showed the fallacy of that were published in 1968, the view is still out there and has enough credence that I am always afraid that a 2% inflation target is going to be viewed as, well, we've been below for so many years, we can be above for so many years. The other thing that seems to be out there is people have learned the wrong lessons from deflation. And they have learned correctly that a lot of deflation is very bad because it's almost impossible for the economy to adjust. Prices are not flexible enough and wages are not flexible enough to get instant adjustment. But that doesn't mean that in a growing economy you can't have a little deflation. The 2% rule was number originally came from a notion that there's a bias in the measurements. It didn't come from the notion that a little inflation is a good thing. But today, a lot of people are thinking that, which means when you hear 2%, you think, well, never much above that. When other people in the markets and other places hear 2%, they think, whoa, that gives them a lot of license.
Yes, absolutely. And I would make the point more generally. I think there are a whole bunch of lessons that I had thought we had all learned about the way the world works from what happened in the 1970s that apparently weren't learned as well as we had originally hoped. But let me speak directly to the 2% inflation target. Your ambivalence about the right level of inflation, I think, echoes the kind of ambivalence that Milton Friedman expressed about what's optimal monetary policy. Does it mean deflation so as to bring about zero interest rates? Does it mean steady money growth to allow for literally zero inflation, or what? And ultimately, he never really decided. He basically said, well, look, compared to what we've had in the past, just choose something and stick with it. And my interpretation of your answer to a similar question, Marvin, is that you agree with that too, and so do I. The way that I would reconcile it would be to say, if we wanted to reopen the question, what's the optimal rate of inflation, perhaps we should. At a minimum, it would help remind people of the costs of inflation, potentially the idea that lower rates of inflation aren't as costly as many people think. That would be fine by me. But here's the thing. The FOMC finally acknowledged or finally publicly announced that it does have a long-run inflation target, and it chose 2%. That was a huge step forward for the Fed because remember, in our day and age, they wouldn't even admit what the Fed funds rate target was. That was a secret. So at least they made some progress there. Now, what could the Fed have done better to emphasize that 2% means 2% and not sort of 2% and sometimes above? I think the great irony that we've learned from recent US monetary history is that everything the Fed wanted to do, and probably has done right since the Great Recession ended, keeping monetary policy accommodative, recognizing maybe that a low setting for the federal funds rate today doesn't necessarily mean that monetary policy is as loose today as it was back when R* was higher, and so on and so forth. All of those decisions could have been couched in terms of meeting the 2% inflation target. They could have just said again and again, inflation is below 2%, and we anticipate that without further monetary stimulus or accommodation, inflation is not going to go back to 2%. So part of the sort of caginess and seeming lack of commitment to the inflation target has been brought about because instead of taking the 2% inflation target and using it to justify what they've wanted to do, they've talked about just about everything except 2% inflation. And then when inflation comes back into the conversation, as you say, it's why not 3 or why not 4? I think that was a huge mistake.
Let me take one or two more.
Nora Lynn Marshall. I don't know how to think about financial bubbles, but it's pretty clear that negative real interest rates for a long time may turn out to have used up all the need to build excess capacity. So investment dries up and there's a lot of money flowing into financial instruments with some serious risks involved in those. How do you fit this into your thoughts?
Yes, that's a good question, too. The way that I would organize my thoughts on that issue would be around the distinction between monetary policy on the one hand and credit policy on the other. One of the things that the Federal Reserve has done, another mistake, I think, was to have gotten so heavily involved in the mortgage markets by buying up MBS. And one of the big challenges going forward is how is the Federal Reserve going to shrink its balance sheet when doing so might mean putting upward pressure on mortgage rates and the political fallout that that would provoke. So I agree with you that credit policy, the Fed shouldn't be involved in trying to allocate credit or trying to influence asset prices. Instead, I would come back to what's the Fed's role as a central bank to manage the money supply in order to control inflation. And sometimes, in order to control inflation, the Fed has to conduct monetary policy that will have effects on credit because everything works through the banking system and banks are suppliers of credit. But whatever decisions are made, I would organize the rationale for those decisions around controlling inflation. And again, I think some of these bubbly aspects in financial markets have been not so much because the Federal Reserve has been overly accommodative in its monetary policies, just because it's overstepped the bounds and tried to allocate credit to specific sectors of the economy instead. Okay. All right, thank you very much.